So within production, essentially what you want to do is that it's not really realistic to have your applications only on your local machine, right? Like you don't want to show someone your app and then open up your server, open up your code, and then open localhost 3000 and have them look on your computer. You actually want them to type in a URL inside of their web browser, or maybe even on their phone, so they can look at it. So that's a much more convenient approach than what we have so far. So that is pushing things into live or pushing things into production. And the key of that is that when you have a local project and you're close to finishing, or if you finish the project or you think it's a good point for you to put it live, then these are the steps that you have to do to get to it as a URL in live production. And there's a lot of tools for it. Just note that if you have different applications, you would use different tools. For example, if you have only front end, say meaning that you don't have anything that has to connect with the back end or any servers, then you would use Netlify or GitHub Pages or Surge. So these are for static pages again. So these are only for HTML, CSS pages, JavaScript, and React pages, nothing without a database. These three here. I would recommend all of them. They actually all work pretty much the same way, but the one we'll be using today is called Netlify. So let me go ahead and send out Netlify inside of the Slack channel and go ahead and create an account while I talk about our other tool. And later on, you can play around with GitHub Pages and Surge as well. There's just other tools to do the same thing. The thing of why we are using Netlify versus the other ones is because it gives you a lot of flexibility of what you can do. It connects to your GitHub for you. So instead of doing a bunch of commands inside of your terminal, you can actually just click on the GitHub repository and have it be live there. These are the type of frameworks that they also support, such as React, Vue, PHP, Python, and Angular, and a whole bunch of others frameworks that you can use just straight out of the box with Netlify. So if you don't have a database, then I would recommend you use Netlify. And there is a pricing to it. All these tools have like a free version and a pricing version. We're only going to use a free version for now, just because we're not going to expand that quickly with our applications. For example, we're not going to have a bunch of team members or have a lot of bandwidths and other add-ons and stuff like that. So we're just going to use just the free version for now. And if you want to use this for your later on like business team or freelancing, you may want to upgrade it to different accounts and stuff as well. But again, I've been using the free version for all of the apps that I push in production, and I'm just fine. Like there's no limits for what you could do or how many apps you can push with this free version here. So that is why we're using Netlify. And once you are signed up, it'll take you into here, and then we'll go into the process of how to push it into Netlify itself. So that is for static pages. It's either Netlify, Surge, or GitHub Pages, and there's other ones, but those three are the most popular ones. So we'll keep this in the back of our minds. But for more complex applications, such as things with databases and having React on Rails, anything like that, then it would be with Amazon Web Services, so AWS, DigitalOcean, and Heroku. So these are the three most popular applications here. AWS is a bit paid, so they ask for your credit card in advance before when you create an account, just so if you do go over the limit, they will take it directly out of your account. DigitalOcean is also paid as well, but I believe there's also the free version too. And then finally, Heroku is a very well-known and well-used application for you to have to push up anything with a server in it. So go ahead and go into Heroku and create an account in Heroku as well. So these are for applications with the database as well as servers, because you need to have them be stored somewhere. And everything that is inside of your database on your local machine, that's totally different than what you would have inside of this database in the live production one. So with this, I would never delete everything in the database inside of Heroku or reset everything. This is where you have to really be careful when you're working in a production level code, because you could mess up your whole application if you do things wrong. So we are using Heroku for apps with databases and servers. And I would bookmark these too, if you haven't already. They're really good tools to have. Now for the example, you can just watch me do it, and if you want to follow along, I would just choose 2 random projects, such as like your About Me, which is mostly HTML, CSS, etc. That's what we're using to push up inside of the Netlify for us to have in production-wide code. For my example, I'm using the JavaScript intro we did as a class. That is where we have this here, where we have inside of the home, we are getting our button, and that changes the pictures if we click on the button. The thing about this is that when we are pushing things inside of your production level, it always looks for the index.html as the home page. So if you have additional pages, it will need to reach it somehow with a nav bar or something. So in our case, since mine is called home instead of index, I'm actually going to switch these 2 file names together, just so the application can recognize that I'm doing this file as the home instead of the other one. I'll just do notes for this one, and then this one is HTML. Or else if you don't specify which one is the index.html, then it won't show anything when you push it into production. It will just give you a blank page. The other thing about this is that make sure that you have the most up-to-date working code. So that means that if you have other partners and teammates that you're working with, make sure that they all are on the same page and you have the most up-to-date code here. And also test it out. So if I do open index.html and then click on this, it should be what is intended. So test out your app. You don't want to push a broken application online. It's very bad for you to have. So make sure that your items are working like intended. Now I really want tacos. Okay. So those are the main things that you need to make sure right before when you do start to push stuff into production. So make sure you have the most up-to-date code, as well as when you do anything that is a static page, meaning that it doesn't need a database, and it's mostly HTML, CSS, JavaScript, make sure that the home page is called index.html. So there's 2 ways to do this. The one inside of your lecture notes is through the terminal. I'm actually going to show you an easier way. So once you create an account here, you will have access to the account at dashboard. And I'll show you around it throughout the whole application. But for now, what we will want to do is we will want to do a new site from Git. And then initially, it will ask you if you want to use GitLab, Bitbucket, or GitHub. We're using GitHub in this particular case. And at first, it won't say authorize like how it did for me. It will first have you authorize it by a plugin within your GitHub. So go ahead and press allow for that, or authorize for the Netlify account when you do have that. After you're done allowing and authorizing that inside of your account, you now have access to all of your repositories inside of your GitHub account. And you have to just search for the repo name. I believe ours is called JS Intro. And it's this one right here. And before I do this, I need to make sure that this here inside of my local machine I'm going to just do a get status and see if there's anything new I need to add before I do this. It looks like I do, so I'm just going to do my get steps real quick. So get add, get commit, push, and get push origin master. So you would also want at this stage to have your GitHub also have the most up-to-date working code as well. So once that is done, go ahead and press deploy site. You don't need to do any of the other settings. We're actually okay with having these things empty. So you can go ahead and do a deploy site. By default, with all of these sites, it will give you a randomized name here. The reason being is that it will try to match it with whatever it is on the Google database, and it has to be a very unique name. So we can't all call ours JS intro because that will conflict within the web browser and the web URL itself. So when you do come up with a regular name, it has to be something that's super unique inside of the web domain side. But by default, it does give you a randomized domain for you to use. So to access it, it will be with, for my case, Vigorous Blackwell, that number, netlify.app. So then if you click on it, that will take you to the live site. Now, instead of you running your server or whatever, you can just send them this link here, like so. That way they can click on tacos all day long, right? So it's just as simple as that. Just push it up into GitHub, make sure everything's up to date and working well, and then deploy it onto Netlify. So let me give you some options that you have, because ideally you don't want this on your business card. That's just weird. You actually want like the name of the app that really describes what this is doing. So if that's the case, then you might need to go to the domain settings. So with the domain settings, there's a couple options that you can do. For example, if you have your own custom domain, like let's say you push your about me, and instead of saying this here, you can just have it be like at henrydome.netlify.app, then, or whatever domain that you buy, you can add it right here. And I think within Netlify, you can look it up, or you have to go to like Google Domains or GoDaddy.com and buy it there as well. So that's one way you can change the URL to be something more descriptive. Just note that if you do that, it is paid depending on what the domain name is. So I know that if you're doing like a .com, it's much more expensive if you're doing like .net. So be careful.
Hey, Henry.
Yes.
Are they managed by like a central place, or like how does it work? Like all the domains, like you just search available domains or see if something is available and it comes up?
Yeah, so if I say like www.henrydome.com, it will check for it for you.
Mm-hmm.
And if you are the owner of that domain, then you'll say yes, add the domain, or else you might have to buy it from somewhere. And then
if you buy it, is somebody hosting it or?
Yep. Yeah. So someone will allocate that out for you so it knows that no one else can use it but you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
But what I like to do instead is, instead of doing that, I would go into general and do change site name. And since most of these, they're mostly like small applications instead of my about me, like this one, I'm not gonna put my full name and taco app. That's just a waste of time for me to do. So if you go into generals and then do change site name, you can actually change it to whatever you would like to call it. It just has to be very unique inside of the Netlify database for all of the domains there. So for example, if I just call it like taco, I believe it's already taken. So you can't just call it a very generic name. So you have to be more creative. What I found that always works is that you may use part of your name, like your full name, to inside of the name itself. So for mine, it's Doan and then like Taco app, like so. And that's unique enough for it to be added and it won't conflict with other people's site. So then instead of going to that URL that we have here, that URL won't work anymore. It'll give you like a 404 page here. Now how you would access it is you would just go to donetacoapp.netlify.com. So then that would be a better approach for your smaller projects. But if you have like a bigger project, like your final project, or even your like about me, your personal portfolio, then I would actually go into your domain management and add it in here for your custom domains. And this is where you would do like a certification for to have it to be much more secure and trusted by most browsers. And that's something you have to pay for and everything as well. Okay. Any questions about the process of pushing it up into Netlify?
If you have something like those sites like Wix, do they just buy a bunch of domains that and make them available?
So with those pre-created application, they do have like their own technology to have their own domain and stuff. So it would be very similar of how Netlify does it. So it has to be like a very unique name throughout the whole Wix database, and it'll be like tacoapp.wix. Their own domain there.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Any other questions? Awesome. So I usually don't do any of the other features that it has, such as plugins and all the other stuff, just because it's mostly paid. So you have to pay for some of these other features like analytics, things like that. So you don't have to worry about it much. That's only for if you are really scaling up your app, if you want to have high traffic areas. So that's the main thing about it. And I would practice it. So inside of your Netlify account, you would have a bunch of your own personal projects up inside of your account. And then you can have these inside of your portfolio and access to them and give them out to people for you to use. And again, these are only for static pages. Sweet. So now let's go into something more complex, which is going to be something that has a database. And go ahead and create a Heroku account, as well as run this here for your tool set. Because we are doing it through the terminal, so there is something you would have to install before you get started. That is this right here. So go ahead and go into Slack, and inside of this link that I gave you, I would just copy this inside of your terminal and then press enter. And that would install the Heroku CLI tools for you.
Do you need to be on the desktop, or like where do you need to be in your terminal? Can you just install it from anywhere?
Yep, you can install it from anywhere. And then for this, since we want to use a much more complex application, we're using a React on Rails application because that has two servers, as well as it has a database attached to it. So this is a case where you would have to use Heroku. You can't upload it to Netlify because it's not supported. It doesn't have any database features for you. So you would have to use another tool like Heroku here. So for the application that I chose is actually the React on Rail blog that we have. And this is the project here. And again, this would work for any React on Rails project initially. We just have to do the necessary steps. Okay. Again, these are the necessary items that you need to do is that make sure that your code works as well as is the most up-to-date working code inside of GitHub. So make sure you have everything that is inside of GitHub because that's where it's pushing it from. It's pushing it from GitHub, not inside of your local machine. So if I do like git status, looks like everything's good. Oh, no. I guess I changed it. Let me do a git add and commit real quick. Just like so. So make sure you push everything up to date into the master branch on GitHub. Okay. So now you're at a good stage for where you should be able to push stuff into production. And remember, one of the housekeeping items inside of your React application, React on Rails application, is that you would have to generate this particular controller. We already did it for this project, but at the very beginning, I told you to generate this controller for later on for when we do stuff in productions. Well, now's the time for me to talk about what this controller actually does. So it is called a static controller, and it has the index action here. And it looks like this. So this is the line you would run at the very beginning of your housekeeping items to generate this file to be used inside of production. So let me go into the file itself. So app controllers, static controller, and it's empty now. What you would do is that this is inside of your lecture notes, and I would recommend putting it in a jest, is that you would replace it with what you have here, like so. And I'll slack this out so you can use it as notes or put in a jest. And what this means is that all of our applications is going to be part inside of both our React and on our Rails. But if we really think about it, this is technically a Rails app, first and foremost. We're putting React inside of this project. So then if we are just pushing this without any other configurations, it will think that we're pushing up just a Rails app. And we don't want that. We want to specify that this is both a React on Rails app. And one of the steps to do that is to add this static controller, saying that to find anything that we need to have rendered, it will be inside of the public folder and then the index.html, like so. It will be in the public folder, and there will later on be an index.html file here. And that is where all of our items in the front end will be displayed in. The other thing that we need to do is inside of our routes, we need to specify that besides the routes that we have in our config routes for our API calls, all the other ones will go into the static index. So it knows that it needs to go back into the front end somehow. So we get other to static index. And make sure that this is the last route here, because if this is first, then all the other routes won't be reached at all. So make sure that this is the absolute last route. So let me slack this out for your notes as well. So this just notes that any other HTTP request or any other request will take you back into the controller itself. Awesome. So those are the first few steps that we need to do. Now let's go ahead and talk about the other steps. So the next step that we need is we need a packaged JSON file inside of our Rails side. We do have one in our client side, but that was mostly for our React side. We want one for the Rails side. And the best way to do that is go inside of your Rails project and just do npm init-y. Sorry, npm init-y. What this will do is it's very similar of how we created a gem file init, and -y just answers yes to all of the questions that it asks. So this one will give you a package.json for us to work with. And inside of production, the package.json is where all the information will be about the app, such as the app name, the description of what the app is, and then like the different versions of it here. Everything else would be fine. We just need to add in one more thing afterwards. So when you do have like different versions of your app, you would change the version here, change the description, etc. But one thing that we need to add is inside of our scripts, we're adding 3 more scripts here. And I'm just going to copy and paste them out for you all. So make sure that inside of your Rails package.json, it has these scripts here. And these are always the same. It would never change. So let's go through this. This is for testing. We don't need this now. These are the 3 scripts that I added. So what we would do is that if we do a build command or if we do a build script, it will go into our client folder, install all of the packages that needs to be installed, and then it will run a build. So what that will do is that if we go inside of our client folder, all of our components and everything together, those are all in separate files and in separate folders. What the build command does is that it will combine everything that has the app working all in one condensed folder and file for us to have deployed. So instead of deploying a bunch of files and folders all at once, which will take forever, you're just deploying that single build folder itself. So what this next one does is that it takes that build folder that we would be able to create, and it will copy it into the public folder inside of our Rails here. And that is just another way to access the front end for when we do bundle it all into that single build folder. And that's also the final locations inside of the static controller. It goes into the public folder to look for index.html. And Heroku post build is a command that runs both of these commands simultaneously. So every time that we are pushing up our code, it runs this command here. We can technically run it ourselves just to update our file, and that works as well, but it will always run it every time that we push things into production. So that is the next step that you need, is you need to add these scripts within your package.json inside of your main directory. Now,
Hey, Henry,
yes.
Quick question. The thing you select out require Rails application control. I'm a little bit behind. Where does that go?
That will go into the static controller.
The static controller, okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Now for the next part, the thing about Heroku is that it doesn't run SQL. It runs a Puma server, which also runs SQL as well. And what we use inside of Rails is a bit different. It's WebRick. So we need to specify that it knows what server it uses to serve up all of our application. So that will be a proc file. And this is one of those things that will always be the same. And I would actually have it inside of a gist if you haven't already. And it will be capital P proc file. And that is a production file that we need to have. And what goes in it is this line of code here. That just specifies what port number we need to listen to for the front end, as well as what server we're serving it up with. So here is the proc file. Okay.
Henry, does the last route get other two static index? Is that also on that controller as well?
No, that goes inside of your routes.
Oh, inside of routes. Okay, sorry.
Awesome. We're almost there. So go ahead and log in and go into Heroku. And you need to know that when we're talking about repositories, there's multiple repositories that we have. The first repository is one on our local machine. The other one is inside of GitHub, right? That is the GitHub repository. And the final repository is inside of the production application. So those are three different types of applications and repositories we need to be aware of. Same goes with databases. So the database inside of your machine, inside of your little elephant in here, that's totally different than what the Heroku uses for its database. Before I go into Heroku, I want to talk a little bit more about it. It does have a paid version. The paid version for it allows you to have team members and also allows your application to make more requests as well as a lot more storage for your database. But to be honest, with the free version, you wouldn't have to reach that limit at all and pay for it. And if you do get really close to the limit, it will email you or notify you in advance just so you know when and where you would need to upgrade your account if needed. And technically, you don't need to update your whole account. You can just update per project, for example. And this follows a very similar pattern as Netlify, where at first it would have a individual, very unique URL name. So make sure that when you do create the project name, it's a unique name. The other thing about this is if we go inside of any of the apps and you launch it, by default, if you're not using it very frequently with the website that you have, it will put the app to sleep and it will wake up within a minute or less than 30 seconds or so. So that's kind of the drawbacks of not having a free account, is because you need to wait for the whole application to load in advance. To get around that, you would have to pay a little bit more, or you can do a request to itself every 30 minutes or so. That might work as well. So those are the only drawbacks with Heroku, but besides that, it's a very powerful tool to use. And if you're using any AWS or DigitalOcean, it follows a very similar pattern as well. Okay, so now that we have those items now, we can now start to build it out inside of our Heroku app and then connect those apps together. So for example, once you log in, it'll take you to the dashboard. You would want to create a new app. And this is like a repository inside of Heroku. So the app name needs to be unique. Again, to make it unique, you may have to attach the name, your last name. And I think this is a React and Rails blog. So React on Rails blog. And it'll tell you if it's available or not for the app name, because it does need to be unique in their database. In my case, it is. If you're on different teams, you can change the app owner, but everything else should be the same. And it will take you into this page here. So before I show you around, we need to follow these steps here to connect it initially inside of our items. There is a way where you can connect it to the GitHub. I don't recommend that for the initial push. I would recommend that later on once everything is all set up. So we're actually going to follow these steps here. So we're doing Heroku Login, and then we will do this here to add the remote. So let's go ahead and go into our terminal. Make sure that you're CD into the project, not inside of the client folder. So you would do Heroku Login. And then it will tell you to press any key to open it up into your browser. And initially, if you're not logged in, it'll ask you to log in. But since I'm already logged in on this tab, you can just press the button logged in. So it may or may not ask for your username and password. So now that you are logged in, go ahead and exit that. You don't need that no more. We don't need the Taco app anymore. And then it will say you're now logged in as your email address here. So that's the first step, is to log in into the Heroku account, just so it knows that it's you that is using it. The second step that you need to do is you would need to copy this line here, and that will add the remote. So when you push into production, you're pushing into this particular repository. So you would need to copy this through your dashboard here for your application. So this is for my particular case. It won't work for yours. Okay. Awesome. So those are the main steps. You don't need to do these other steps because we technically will be doing them or have already done them. So it's just this step and this step that Heroku that you should do at first. So now goes into the next step. So we're still having an issue for, if we do push this up, it will still think it's a Rails app because it does look like a Rails app just straight out of the get-go. So we need to specify that this is both a React on Rails application. So how to do that is you would type in these commands here within your project directory. So it'll be Heroku build packs, and this is what tells Heroku of what it's built with. So at first, let's just clear out of whatever it thinks that whatever app it thinks it is. So we'll do a Heroku build packs :clear. Just so it's not assuming that we're having just a Rails app or just a React app. And then we need to set our first build pack to be the React side. So the Heroku build packs :set, and then the Heroku term for all of the things that have to do with JavaScript servers and also React, since if you boil down inside of React, it's technically just a node project in disguise. So we're technically having this be a Node.js build pack. So that is the first step.
So is Node.js and React, are those kind of interchangeable then?
Kind of.
Like when you talk about, when you're talking about it?
How we're using Node is that we're running the server, and that's what is running our servers, the Node.js. But React is more of a tool and a way to develop. So you can't use like components or state and stuff inside of Node.js. Yep.
Got it. Thanks.
Technically, you can use it in replacement with Rails if you wanted to. But again, you have to replace all of the MVC stuff within Node.js with that. So now we need to also specify that we also have a Rails app, which is technically mostly all Ruby, because Rails is itself a Ruby library. So then instead of setting it, we need to add in addition to this build pack here. So it's build packs :add, and it is a Heroku Ruby, like so. And we need to set it to the index of 2, just so it doesn't replace the current build packs we have. Awesome. So now we do like a get status. Again, we need to make sure everything is up to date. We did add and change some stuff, like we did change our static controller as well as our routes, and added a prop file and a package.json. So we need to add that into our GitHub. So get add and then get commit push files. like so, and then git push origin master. Okay. So for this next part, it's probably going to be the longest part inside of your process, is pushing your whole entire application into Heroku. So we take a look at our remotes that we have. We have two remotes. The first one being Origin, which is our GitHub, and the second one being Heroku. So when we are pushing stuff into Heroku, it will pull in from the most up-to-date branch from Origin. So we technically have two remotes here with different branches for each of them. So if we want to do a push, we would push it into GitHub for if we want to store it somewhere. But if we want to push it into production, it will be Heroku. So that is the origin name. So it will be get push Heroku master. Get push Heroku master. Because we want to push everything into Heroku. And that will run a bunch of lines of code for us. It will do this particular scripting where it does the build file, build folder for us and creates in the client as well as in the public. So it will do that for us. And then it will run all of the updated gems and packages and everything for us too. So just let that run. If there's errors, we'll address them. You know if it's error, if it's like all red or something. And let me go ahead and show you around within the Heroku dashboard here. Okay, so inside of overviews, you can add additional add-ons and other items here, but this is where you can see who's been doing what within the Heroku application. For example, if you have like other people working, you can see when and who pushed up the versions as well as who pushed it to the latest versions and activities here. Resources, we're actually okay with the main resources that we have. These are where if you do need to add in more data inside of your database or you need to make more requests, this is where you would add them for it. For example, for dynos, that's where you would extend your dynos for particular actions to have to extend your database. So you may have to pay for dynos there. And here is the deployment tab. This is where you would be grabbing the information such as the remote and login steps. And you can also hook it up into GitHub. So I'll show you how that works after everything's done. Don't do this step when you're trying to initially push it up. You would do this for during or towards the end of it. Metrics is something you would have to pay for. So again, that's like Google Analytics, see how many people visit the site, things like that. Activities, this is actually its own tab of what it shows right here. And here is access. So this is what you would do, especially in your final groups, is that you would add collaborators and you would search them up through your emails. Then they will have access to this particular dashboard and project within Heroku. So then they're able to read and write, so they're able to push stuff as well as to pull it from production and make changes there. And you can actually change the ownership within this tab as well. But since it's only myself, I'm the main owner. And here is settings. And this is where you'll be doing a lot of the configurations here. So here is the URL for the get URL. So you can actually use your remote right here too. We'll talk about what the vars are in a bit. This will tell you what kind of build packs that you're doing. Make sure that this says for your React and Rails app, both Node.js and Ruby. If it's not, that means that you skipped the step of adding the build packs there. So make sure that you do have these two here. If you're just pushing a Rails app, just make sure that this is just Ruby. Here is the SSL, which is where you would have a HTTPS instead of just a regular HTTP. That's just for security reasons. And you have to pay for that feature and configure it yourself. This is where you would add your domain, like your custom domains that you have. but by default, it will be what you specified right here. So if you don't create a name, it will create one for you. And if you change it, it will be whatever you would change, but it would be .herokuapp.com. If you want a much more custom domain, you would have to find it in GoDaddy and Google Domains again, and then you would add the domain and configure it here. Here's the transfer app. You can actually turn maintenance mode on and off. That way it will show like a message saying that you're working on a site instead of having your site being broken during the time, and then deleting the application here. There's no going back from this. So if you delete the app, it will delete the whole entire app as well as anything inside of the database. So make sure that you are 110% sure that you want to do this. And that is the settings. Let's go back into vars here. Don't show these variables to anyone. I'm just showing you this because I'm going to delete this app later on. But with this here, this is where you would add your API keys. Later on, we'll have a lecture that we would use third-party APIs. And to use third-party APIs, like if you're using like Spotify's API or Facebook or Twitter, you need to have both a key value pair for you to have access to those accounts. And with those key value pairs, you would need to put it inside of your local machine for it to work and inside of production. So this is where you would put them for inside of production. That way you have access to all the features within your third-party API. And these are the variables here. Okay, that's pretty much it for it. There's a way where you can star it as well as you can look at your logs. And this is what it runs inside of the server. So if you have any server errors, it will actually do it here. But you can technically access this with Heroku logs. And this is really good for debugging. Awesome. But the main thing that you would do is you would open your app. You can press this button to open it, or inside of your terminal, you can do Heroku open. Both of those work the exact same way. Sweet. Now with this, I have my home, about, and post, because this is my blog that we have here. But if you go ahead and submit this, there's supposed to be a post that goes right here. Now, that doesn't apply yet. The reason being is that within Heroku, it doesn't run our migrations at all. So we need to do that as well. So to run your migrations inside of Heroku, it will be using the Heroku command run Rails DB migration. So migrate, I mean. And that will apply everything to the database. And if you have any seeded items, you would do a seed here too. But in my case, I don't, so that doesn't apply here. And it will be like so. So now that will run all my migrations and apply it into the production level database here. That way, when I do create anything, it will create it in my production level code. So now let's try that again. So I already created my migrations. Now you can see that it now saves it inside of production. And I can refresh it, it's still there. And the other thing that you can do here is you can actually go inside of your console, inside of the IRB session within your production level database. Again, be careful when you're in this because it is production level code. There's no going back from it if you do any of the CRUD actions inside of the console. So I would absolutely be sure that you want to go in the console first and foremost. But in our case, I'm just going to do a post.all. You can see that this is the post that I have within my database here. Awesome. And that is pretty much it for the steps within Heroku. There's a lot of other Heroku commands, and there's a sheet within your lecture notes for you to take a look at with that. So any questions about the process of pushing stuff into production within Heroku?
So where is it actually storing the data? Is it in like a Heroku server?
Yep, they have a bunch of servers inside of their companies, and that stores it within its own server.
So then is there like a size limit for the amount you can store? If you had some
Yeah.
huge applications.
Yeah. So it will let you know if you're reaching the limit, and what the database that it has, it will give you size for that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Any other questions? Awesome. So again, with these particular items, you would just follow the steps here inside of your lecture notes. And that's pretty much it for having your stuff be production level code. So I would use Netlify for static pages and then Heroku for those more complex pages with a database and server. Something else that I would release as well is that working in GitHub when you are having this type of process. So within GitHub, when you're working in teams, more likely or not, you're going to be working on different branches as well as different parts of the whole entire project. What you would do is that during the project, at multiple stages of the project, if it's at a good point, I would strongly recommend you all get together and have your code most up to date of what's everyone collaborating on. And how that would work is that since everyone's inside of their own branch, no one works inside a master branch. The reason being is that the master branch is considered the most up-to-date working code. So that is what the master branch is the most up-to-date working code. All the other branches besides that are extra things that you're going to add in addition inside of master. So for example, inside of the project, you'll have a feature branch called like styles or navbar or controllers or models. And then that is later on going to be part of the master branch later. What you would do, and this is the process that I would strongly recommend you all do, is that inside of your repository, you would then push your code, if it's at a good point, into your own branch. So you can see here in this older project, you would push it out into its own branch. And make sure it works and you tested it out and everything, because again, you don't want broken code pushed into your master branch. So once you push it into the particular item here, what I would recommend is that I would run the GitHub steps of getting your code up to date before you push. So this is this flow right here. So the collab flow here. So make sure that you're adding and committing and then grabbing the most up-to-date code within GitHub. So fetching and rebasing. That will either give you conflicts or not. You're hoping for no conflicts. So, but I would try to avoid conflicts as possible by working in other pages and components and other features. But if there are some conflicts, these are the steps you would do. If there's not, then go ahead and push that into your own branch. So that is this step right here, is pushing it into your own branch. Once you have it in your own branch, what you would do after that is you will go inside of the pull request and do a new pull request. Oftentimes, for initially when you do it inside of your own branch, it might give you like a pop-up here of do a new pull request with that branch. You can do it that way as well. So if you do create a new pull request, what you would have is you would have whatever branch you want to compare it to, like let's say about. And then you would press create pull request like so. And essentially how all of the repositories that we have for your final project works is that you can't push into master until you have an approved pull request. So this is that process here. It's that within the pull request, once you create the pull request, you can like write a description and the name of what you're doing. Then it's going to be at this page right here of where you're going to wait for someone else to review your items here. So typically, if it's like a big major change, like let's say like you're pushing up like your initial project with all your database and packages and all that, that will be something that I would request the reviewers be either myself, Harlan, or Nick, or one of the team project managers. Just so initially nothing won't be too drastic of a change. But for like smaller features such as like styling or the nav bar or like another page, I would go for the reviewers to be any one of your other teammates. So make sure that you would assign the reviewers accordingly. You can do that with reviewers or with the assignees. During that process, if it's approved, then it will be inside of the master branch. Then it will be the next person's turn to update the master branch. So you would actually take turns doing this process. But if there's some reason for a conflict, like so, you would need to have this be disapproved. And then you have to fix the conflict according to what it is. For example, this one, we have two different types of code here. We would need to change it up a bit for it to work. So that is the pull request method of doing things. So when you are reviewing the, other people's code, what you would do is you would go into the pull request itself, and then this will list out all of the individual commits. This only has one commit because of the item here. And you would see that this is what is inside of the branch, inside of master branch currently, and this is what they want to add or delete. So the green means add, red means delete. And make sure that they're following like the best practice. Make sure that you have the right things. This is where good communication really comes into play. So this is what you would have to be done. And if everything looks good, you can do review changes, approve, or request changes. If you press request changes, leave a comment of what they need to change, right? Just don't leave them hanging saying that you need to change your code like so. And then once it is approved, there will be a button here that says merge into master. It will be right down here. And then it will also say delete the branch as well as close the pull request. Go ahead and do that as well. And then you would do that for the rest of the project. And you would actually create another branch for your next feature that you're working on. So make sure you do this one by one for all your teammates. And at the very end, do a final fetch and pull for you to have the most up-to-date code inside of master. So that's what this document is saying here. Awesome. Any questions about that process? Okay, let's go ahead and go into our first break. When we come back from breaks, we're actually going to talk about a new topic called hooks. And hooks is pretty cool. So let's come back at 7:15. So now let's go ahead and move into our next topic, which is going to be talking about hooks. So hooks here, let me go ahead and send you this article, is a tool that you can use inside of React itself. And it's a very useful tool that's paired off with other things that you can use within React. So instead of downloading a third-party like package or any gems or anything like that, it's actually already pre-built into the latest 16.8 React version. And it's really cool. So let me give you a brief introduction with what they are and how to use them and what we can do with them. So when we are thinking about components, when we build out our React app, there's technically two types of components. There's the logical component as well as presentational components. And the difference between the two is that if you want to do anything logical, then you would need to do a logical component. And that works, but it doesn't work very well for if you have a bunch of things inside of your presentational component, and then all of a sudden you need to add some functionality, then you need to change the whole entire component into a logical component. So that's a pretty inconvenience there. The other thing is that with the class component, class doesn't really give you a lot of flexibilities, and it conflicts with things here and there within the React library. So it's not as efficient as it can be. But if you're using a presentational component, it's a lot more efficient, and there's a lot less conflicts that you have. So essentially what hooks allows us to do is it allows us that it gives us access to everything that we have inside of a logical component, mainly the state and the lifecycle methods. We are actually able to do that inside of our presentational components. So when we are hooking, we're hooking on into those stateful features here. So in reality, technically, you don't really need to ever use a logical component. You may need one here or there, but you can now always be using presentational components. So those are the idea of what hooks are. And again, just reviewing about state. State is a whole object itself, and we're using that inside of our presentational components. So this is directly from the documentation itself. So hooks are functions that allow you to hook into React states and lifecycle features from functional components. That's just another word for a presentational component. They don't work inside of classes at all. So if you try to use these inside of your logical components, it won't give you the same results just because it already has those features inside of those logical components. And it always reuses the stateful logic, not state itself. So it uses a different version of state, not directly with state. And here's some of the reasons why you would need to use hooks. It's a very new feature that just recently came out, and it really changed the way of how all of the developers inside of React actually develops. Technically, they're not going to change all of their stuff into hooks and presentational components. They're still using logical components here and there, but now going forward, they're actually using presentational components more, as well as using hooks more. So this is where the future holds for when you are working in React. You're actually going to be using a lot more hooks instead of using those logical components. And it gives you the exact same features as what you have within your logical components without actually doing the great transition between the two. And classes don't minify well, but React const does. So that is another reason. And it also makes things unreliable and hot reloading, which is the update, really messy for when we do use logical components. So just note that if you are having a presentational component, ask yourself the question of, do you need to change it into a logical component? Or if you need to have any state, or if you need to have any logic or any lifecycle methods, then you would use the presentational component with hooks. So that's the question you would ask yourself. So is it a logical or presentational component? And then later on, if it's a presentational component, do I need to use hooks? So let me show you the different types of hooks. These are the new ones that came out, and here's how you would use them, like so. So there is the state hook as well as a bunch of other things too. So let's talk about the state hook here. So here is what it will look like. Instead of using the default state hook like so, because we're in a presentational component, we actually need to have your parentheses after the declaration to be a curly brace. So that's the first change that you need to have, is that you need to have it be a explicit return instead of implicit. So then it would be the curly brace, and you need to return whatever is you're returning with JSX. So that is one of the transitions from using a presentational components with a presentational components with hooks. The other thing that you would have is that if you want to have state, instead of having it be in this format, it will actually be in this format right here. And again, hooks look super weird at first, but when you actually use them here and there and play around with them and know how they work, it will actually make a lot more sense. So what this is that it's the use state hook. This allows you to have individual values to be stored into the state using hooks. So what these items are called, the first parameter of this box bracket is called count. So we're calling this value count. We're building a counter here. The set count here is a function that allows you to change this particular value stored inside of state. That's very similar of doing like another function as well as doing a this.set state. But instead of doing both of those items, you can just say set count. So it actually cleans up your code a lot more faster. So how it's used is that if I want to reference the value, I reference it by the name here, whatever you put inside of this particular column. So instead of saying this.state.count, you can just say count. That is the other item that we're changing. That we can directly call it by name instead of saying this.state.name. The other thing is that if I want to increment the count or change it, I would just say set count and then change it to whatever I'm changing it to. So this is the equivalence of saying this.set state, the count key, to be the value of this.state.count +1 or ++ or however it is you're incrementing. So instead of doing that step, we're actually saying set count to be equal to the new value here. And that is the use state hook. And it allows you to hook on into the storage aspect of a logical component. Again, it will look a lot more simpler afterwards. So let me kind of break this down of what this is actually doing. So this is technically the syntax returns 2 items for you. And the order does matter for these particular items because the first one is what is referencing this particular value. That is the key of the value that you have in your state. That is this column right here. The second one is a function that lets you update this particular value. That will be a function that lets you update it. And that is the equivalence of doing this .set state or a function that does the set state for you. So make sure that when you are naming it, it would be like the name of the key and then the function name of changing it. So you could say like set whatever or change whatever, things like that. Make sure it makes more sense than anything. So how this actually works is that the reason why it's in an array is how it's being created. So when you're using a set state, it actually runs these 3 lines in parallel. So it will return to you a pair of items here inside of an array. And what we're doing is that with the count, we're setting that to the first individual position, and then the set count to be the second individual position. So the count is what we are setting the value to, the key to the value, and then the set count is a function that lets us update it. And that's how this line of code works, like so. So then when we use it, we can just say count, and when we change it, we can say set count. And then there's some other things that we need to know, such as instead of saying this say.count, we're using count, changing it like so instead of doing this set state. So since we're doing it this way, this say actually updates the state variable, but when we are doing this way with hooks, it actually replaces it instead of merging it together. So it actually works a lot more better in the long run. And that is the state hook right here. It will be the use state hook. And you would need to import that from the React library if you want to use it inside of your presentational components. Now you may be wondering, what if I want to store more values inside of my state? Well, if you want to have multiple items inside of your state, it'll just be multiple state hooks. So for example, if I have like an age, fruit, and to-dos array inside of my state, then you would just have multiple lines like so. And each of these have their own declaration of what the key is, and then a function to update the state. So you can store like numbers, you can store like strings or arrays of objects or other objects, etc., within the parentheses itself. But typically, since you're working with React and Rails, it will technically be like an empty, or like by default like an empty string or zero or empty array, and you're actually filling it within like an API call from your database. So that is how you would do it with a multiple declaration of a state hook. Any questions about that? Okay, so now let's go ahead and talk about the next hook, which is the effect hook. The effect hook allows you to hook on into the side effects of other components. And that is very confusing to think about because of what's going on with the mounting and unmounting and all the other items that is going on within React itself. So it's really good for data fetching and subscription and manipulating the DOM at a certain time. So it works like a lifecycle method of a component did mount, a component did update, and a component will unmount. Those three lifecycle methods all at the same time. So if you're using any sort of lifecycle methods within your presentational components, you would actually use a effect hook. And that comes from the side effects of affecting other components that can't be done inside of the render. And you can read a little bit more about that within the documentation. So if you want to use it, you need to import it from the React library. And this is the individual syntax for it. It's technically its own function. And you write it like a component did mount or update or component did unmount. So this is where you would do like your API calls or whatever you want to do before the component mounts or when it does update or when it's taken off of the DOM. So that is the better thing to do. Instead of calling a function, you can just do a use effect hook, like so. So since the effects, they are declared within the component, so they have access to both the props that the component has as well as the state. So you can actually use both the state hook and the use effect hook in parallel. By default, it will always be running the use effect initially at the first time. So it runs like a component did mount. So it always runs it in the first render and then a re-render. If it happens after the render, that means you're doing component did unmount, and use effect is actually going to be different. So you can have your use effect be doing different things depending on whether it's mounted or unmounted. So let me give you a better example. Again, this is the one from the documentation. So we have a use effect here. So initially, if you mount onto the page, it will subscribe to all of your friends' status update. Then when you unmount, then it will unsubscribe you from it. So you can actually do two of the functions depending on whether it's mounted or unmounted. And this is really good if you have like a cleanup phase or returning of functions, things like that. So that is the use effect. In most cases, you would use them inside of like a component did mount type of scenario where you grab all of the to-dos within your database with an Axios call and then set that into your state. So that's what you would be mostly using it for. Nothing too crazy like the friend subscription here. So any questions about the effect hook? Okay, so we'll talk about two more hooks, which is going to be the context hook and the flex hook. So the context hook allows you to hook on into your context API that you have. So if you have any context APIs that you already create, then you can hook onto them with the context hook itself. You have to import it at the very top and then do the use context and you're able to use them. This is very good for like themes and like fonts and stuff like that. But if it's more complex for like your authentication or your other provider stuff, then I would use it the same way of how you've been using it within your context API. So you wouldn't do it with a hook. These are more of like simpler things like so. So that is the context hook. Now the Flux hook actually leads me to tell you about what Flux is. And does anyone have an idea of what movie Flux is from? Like what movie reference?
Back to the Future.
Oh yeah, Back to the Future. So with this is actually another solution to prop drilling. Again, prop drilling is for you to have your props being passed down from parent to child, parent to child, parent to child, all the way down to the tree, and using that for within your application. But a better way to do that is to put it into your global state. And how we're doing it is that we're doing it with the context API. But the other way to do it is actually with a third-party pattern called the Flux pattern. And it's actually the same exact thing that we're doing. They're just calling things different names. For example, instead of a global state, they're calling it a global store. Instead of a particular like providers or items within the providers, they call it dispatchers and actions. And then the views is just whatever we are displaying back there. So it's just the same exact tool that we are using. It just uses it in a different way. And the package that does this really well is called Redux. There's other packages that has it as too, but Redux is really paired off with React itself. So this allows you to have a global state, or technically a global store, for you to store all your items. And if you need to have other functions to be accessed globally, then you would need to do a action and dispatcher within your tool here. And there's a lot of other libraries here that achieves the same things, but it uses a different way. And you can also see here that it has like Marty.js, Fluxer. It all goes into the Back to the Future reference there. So Redux itself is a package that you can add on, and you just do React Redux as well as the Redux package. And then you have access to the whole entire library for you to use for the global store. The only crappy thing about this is you have to set it up every single time. So you have to do these steps here for every single one of your Redux React project. So I would put this in a gist and then put this inside of your Redux so you don't need to configure the store ever again. And then you're having your provider like normal. And that is where you would define all of the things that you want to have globally. So within the provider, the really cool reason of why people use Redux over the context API is the ability to use reducers. So with reducers, it looks like this. There's actually, is there a much more completed one here? I guess not. Oh, here we go. So it'll look like this for all your CRUD actions. So what you would do is that within the reducer itself, it's just a switch statement, which is just like an if-else statement. We're checking to see if whatever action you're dispatching, it'll do certain things. So you would have all your functions, but when you notice when you are doing that function, you need to, like, if you're creating, you need to create within your backend as well as your front end. Same thing with update, you need to update the backend as well as the front end. What this reducer does is that it will take care of all those cases for you for the front end. So you can only worry about the backend information. So when you do a Axios call, you would just do the Axios call of like create to do, and then a dispatcher of a like add to do action. And that will add it into the global store or global state within Redux. So these are individual cases to handle that change within the front end. And that is what a reducer is. And this reducer is very common to use. It's actually used in other libraries, including the one within your hooks as well. So with the Flux hooks, it allows you to have reducers to update those changes within your front end here. So inside of your reducer, if you have a switch statement that has those particular actions already defined, then you can update your state like so. So that is the Flux pattern, and using the use reducer hook to tap into those features. So technically you don't need to install a whole nother package like Redux. You can actually just use this hook to use that feature of the reducers. So I'll also give this lecture out for you just so you can walk through it and see how Redux is different from the context API. Okay, and that is the Flex hook. And those are the 4 main hooks that you'll encounter with and use with. I'm pretty sure they'll be creating a lot more hooks for us, but those are the main ones that they have thus far. So here is to kind of give you the rule set of using hooks, because there's certain things that you can't do with hooks at all. For example, they only work in presentational components. If you try to use this in a logical component, it won't work at all. You can only call hooks at a top level. So if you have a lot of like parent to child components, like if you're rendering a bunch of components within a bunch of other components, this will only work within the top higher order component. It won't work with all those children below. I would also not recommend calling hooks within loops or conditions or nested functions, just because you'll get like an infinite loop or infinite recursion, things like that. So that will really mess up your programming if you do put it inside of these things here. And finally, you can use any of these features in conjunction with each other. So you're not limited to just using like a use state or use effect. You can actually use all 4 of them, or just 2 of them, or 3 of them, etc. And then if you want to learn more about it, the React documentation that I sent out, it gives you a lot more detailed reference at it. This guy actually does a talk with it, but I think, let me check. Yeah, it's 1 hour, 35 minutes long. What I like to do sometimes is like, I used to travel a lot, like to and from work. So this is a really good thing to put on when you're traveling or when you're doing something for a long period of time, just so you can listen in the background. But in some cases, he does show examples, like right here. That's something to pay attention to. So you might have to look at those spots as well. So yeah, that is hooks. Again, I would, if you're not comfortable with hooks yet, I would start to get comfortable with them by just converting slowly all of your presentational components into presentational components with hooks, as well as logical components to presentational components. Because that's where the future of React is looking at. They're no longer using logical components, they're mainly using these hooks here with presentational components. Okay, any questions about hooks? Just practice them. They will look a lot more better and less confusing. Awesome. So I'm going to release a lecture. The lecture also has a follow along that's continuing from yesterday's lecture, and it will add hooks into like yesterday's lecture. So if you are interested, I would look into that as well. So let's go ahead and take our final break. We'll break early so we can work into our projects. Let's come back at 7:50.